On the night of October 14th, Meredith Rose stood at the top of a marble staircase in a ballroom full of people who mattered, and she pointed down at the man mopping the floor she was about to walk across. She was 31, vice president of brand communications at Ashby Vaughan, and she'd spent 7 years perfecting the art of looking straight through her own husband. Her voice carried, bright and clipped, loud enough that the champagne stopped moving. "This man doesn't belong here. Get him out." Nobody in that lobby looked at his face. Not the executives, not the investors, not the security chief who finally took him by the arm. They saw a gray uniform and a mop, and as far as they were concerned, that was all there was to see. Elias Barone was 33 years old, black hair cut short, a thin scar along the knuckles of his right hand that he'd never explained to anyone. A plain silver ring he didn't take off, not even to scrub a floor. He didn't argue, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't look back, and he didn't need to, because down at the harbor there were 400 men who would stop a crane in midair if he so much as lifted a hand, and not a single person in that ballroom could have told you why a man like that had been pushing a mop through their building at night for 3 years. He had his reasons. They were older than the marriage, older than the company, and they'd been waiting up on the 19th floor the entire time. His wife had just thrown him out of her own party. In 9 days, she'd find out exactly who she threw out, and so would every other person standing in that room. If you're here for stories about dignity, and about the people we walk past without ever really seeing, hit that like button now. Share this with someone who'd appreciate it, and subscribe with the bell turned on, so you don't miss what comes next. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. Now let's go back to that lobby, to the mop, and to the woman who had no idea what she'd just done. The glass door closed behind Elias with the soft sigh of a hydraulic hinge, and inside the ballroom, the music rose again, as though nothing had happened at all. He stood on the wet sidewalk beneath the yellow glow of the awning lights, and it was some time before he realized that he was still holding the mop. No one had thought to take it back. They had pushed him out through the door, along with the mop, along with the gray uniform, along with the very notion that all 3 of them were one and the same, and now they stood together outside in the night. He bent down and carefully propped the mop against the brick wall, its handle turned outward so no one would trip over it, exactly the way he did every night when he stopped to rest. Inside, beyond the glass, Tessa Quinn stood motionless behind her service cart. She had opened her mouth. She remembered that moment clearly, even the feeling of air passing over her teeth, even the sentence that had already formed in her mind, that this man worked here, that he worked the night shift with her, that he had more right to stand on that floor than most of the people in that room. Then she looked down at her hands. The skin between her fingers had split into thin, pale pink lines, the kind bleach left behind after too many winters, and she thought of the employee badge in her pocket, and she thought of her younger sister, and she remained silent. A few guests turned to look at her, not out of curiosity, but because she was blocking the way. She lowered her head and continued wiping the water from the floor, slowly and carefully, pushing her cart back against the wall to make room for expensive shoes to pass. No one said anything to her. No one needed to say anything to her, and for many days afterward, that silence would return to find her in the latest hours of the night, when she lay listening to the steady hum of the machine in the room next door, and she would wonder how much a single sentence cost, and she would know the answer exactly, because she was the one who had paid for it. Outside, a black car was parked along the curb, its red taillights casting their glow across the wet pavement. It had been there since before he was escorted out. The rear door opened, and a woman stepped out, her hair gathered neatly into a bun, a dark coat around her shoulders, her heels striking the concrete 3 times before she stopped at a respectful distance from him. Sloane Pryor didn't look at the mop. She was the only person that entire night who didn't look at the mop. She looked directly into his face, and for a moment she stood perfectly still, long enough for him to understand that she had been sitting in the car and had witnessed everything through the glass, and that she had chosen not to step out even 1 second sooner. "He passed away this morning," she said, "before the sky was fully light. He wasn't in pain. He didn't wake up, and he didn't have time to leave any further instructions beyond those he gave long ago." Elias didn't answer. She waited. She had been his family's attorney since he was too small to reach her shoulder, and she had learned that with the Barone family, the silence that followed a piece of news was always longer than the silence that followed a question. "That seat belongs to you," she continued. "As of this morning. There is no one else, and there are no conditions. They're waiting for you at home. Some of them have been waiting since morning. Elias still didn't turn toward her. He was looking through the glass into the brightly lit hall beyond, where the marble floor shimmered beneath the chandeliers, the left half already cleaned, the right half still untouched. The boundary between the two halves ran in a perfectly straight line, from the foot of the staircase to the door, as clear as a mark drawn with a ruler. And within half an hour, it would disappear beneath hundreds of footprints, and no one in the world would ever know it had been there. "I haven't finished cleaning," he said. Sloane tilted her head slightly. "What did you say?" "The right half," he said. "I haven't finished the right half." She followed his gaze to the floor, then looked back at him, and for the first time in many years, she didn't know how to respond. The wind blew uphill from the harbor, carrying the smell of salt water and engine oil, the scent he had known since childhood, the scent that had always clung to his grandfather's coat, to his uncle's coat, to the clothes of the 400 people down there, whom not one person in the ballroom behind him had ever thought about. He pulled off his rubber gloves, tucked them into his back pocket, and remained there a little longer. Then he said, in a voice as calm as though he were discussing the weather, that his uncle had a saying he often repeated on weekend evenings, that a man who knew who he was didn't need anyone else's recognition, and that for all those years, Elias had believed those words were meant as comfort. "And now?" Sloane asked. "Now I think they were a warning," he replied. He walked toward the car. When he reached the door, he stopped and turned his head to look one last time at the mop, leaning against the brick wall, then bent down and slipped inside. The door closed. The red taillights glided across the wet street and turned onto the road leading down toward the harbor. And behind them, inside that brightly glowing glass building, people were still raising their glasses. Elias reached the apartment before she did, and he had already changed out of his uniform, folded it neatly, and placed it on a chair when he heard the key turn in the lock. Meredith came inside without taking off her shoes. That was the first detail he noticed, because in the 7 years they had lived together, she had never worn shoes inside the apartment. Not once, not even on the latest nights, and the way she walked straight across the hardwood floor to the kitchen table told him more than anything she was about to say. She placed a thin file on the table, neatly fastened, every corner of every page perfectly smooth. He didn't need to bend down and read it to know what it was. "I had someone in the legal department draft it during the summer," she said. "Take your time and read it carefully. There isn't anything unexpected in there." He slowly pulled out a chair and sat down, then asked if she wanted something to drink. She said no. He got up anyway, poured her a glass of water, set it beside the file, and returned to his seat. Neither of them raised their voice even once during that conversation. And later, when Meredith looked back on that night, she would realize that this was what unsettled her most. "You think I betrayed you?" she said. "I know you do, but I didn't betray you. I simply kept moving forward, while you remained in the same place for 7 years. He turned the glass in a slow circle on the table without drinking from it. "Go on," he said. "People ask me what my husband does," she said, "in places where a single answer can decide whether they'll ever call me back, and I have to stand there among people whose every sentence is worth an entire year of your salary, and I have to tell them something. Do you know what that feels like? Have you ever imagined what it feels like to have half a second to decide whether to tell the truth or find some way around it?" He said he knew. She gave a quiet laugh, short and empty, with no amusement in it. "You don't know. You've never had to introduce anyone to anyone. You leave the house when it's dark and come home when the sun is rising, and you don't tell me anything, and eventually I stopped asking, and you simply let things stay that way. You let them stay that way for 7 years, Elias, and now you're sitting there looking at me as though I'm the one who walked away." He raised his head. It was the first time all evening that he looked directly into her eyes. "Did you ever ask me where I worked?" he said. "Just once, in 7 years." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She stood there with one hand still resting on the edge of the table, and in that silence, there was only the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of a car passing on the street below, and nothing else. "I was busy," she finally said. He nodded as though that were a valid answer, and perhaps it truly was. "You were busy," he repeated. Then, in the same calm voice, he told her that he had begun working the night shift in that building before she arrived, that he had crossed that lobby on hundreds of nights before her nameplate was mounted on the door upstairs, and that if she had asked him, even once, she wouldn't have had to stand at the top of the staircase and point down at him. "I was there before you," he said. Meredith didn't answer. She pulled out a chair, then pushed it back in, and in the end, she remained standing. "That doesn't change anything," she said. "No," he replied. "It doesn't change anything." He went on to say that there had been years when they had lived with very little. Years when his mother was gravely ill, and he had carried the burden of her hospital bills until the very end, and that through all of it, Meredith had never complained. Not even once. He still remembered that. He wanted her to know that he still remembered it. Meredith lowered her eyes to the file and said that the apartment had been in her name from the beginning, so that matter was already settled and didn't need to be discussed any further. She opened the file, pointed to the place where he was supposed to sign, and told him to think it over, that no one was rushing him, but that he shouldn't wait too long. He stared at the empty space for a long while. Then he closed the file, pushed it back toward her, and said he wouldn't sign it that night. It wasn't because he wanted to hold on to her. He needed to learn one thing first, and once he knew, he would sign, and he would sign that very day. She asked what it was. He told her she wouldn't understand, and there wasn't a trace of sarcasm in his voice when he said it. It sounded almost like an apology. Meredith gathered the papers from the table and slipped them into her briefcase. Mixed among them was a stack of official company letters bearing the corporate logo, printed on thick paper with raised lettering, which she had brought home that afternoon to review one final time before they were sent out. She hurriedly swept them inside, closed the briefcase, and didn't give them another thought. Then she went into the bedroom and closed the door. Elias remained seated in the kitchen for a very long time, beside the glass of water she hadn't touched, until the sky beyond the window began to fade into that particular shade of gray known better by those who work the night shift than by anyone else. The brownstone on Federal Hill still held the same scent of weekend evenings from his childhood, the smell of coffee gone cold and polished wood, and by the time Elias stepped inside, daylight had fully broken. Sloane was waiting for him in the dining room, with a cardboard box resting on the long table. It was a small box, the kind people used to store records, and both sides had softened with age. "Mr. Aldo kept it all this time," she said. "He never opened it again. He only instructed me to give it to you when you took the seat." Elias didn't open it right away. He stood looking at it, his hands still buried in the pockets of his coat, and Sloane understood that she should leave the room. So she did. His mother, Rosalie Barone, had cleaned the corridors on the 19th floor of that building for more than 20 years. She had started before the building had glass elevators, back when work schedules were still written by hand in pencil, and she showed up so faithfully that there were winters when the entire building closed because of a snowstorm, and she still came to work because she said floors couldn't clean themselves. Then, one afternoon in March, someone handed her a piece of paper. On that paper was a word used to describe a thief, and beneath it was a signature. She wasn't allowed to say anything. She wasn't allowed to return to her locker and collect her belongings. They made her stand there in the middle of the corridor while people stepped out of their offices to watch, and then someone came over, took her by the elbow, and escorted her all the way to the front door, across that marble lobby, beneath the eyes of everyone whose floors she had cleaned, so they could walk across them every morning. She died not long afterward, and that word remained attached to her name. And in the brief obituary printed in the local newspaper, no one mentioned those 20 years at all. Elias opened the box. There wasn't much inside. Only a handkerchief folded into a neat square, a pocket calendar, a pair of reading glasses with plastic frames, and at the bottom, an unsealed envelope. He had read the letter inside it no fewer than 100 times over the past 3 years, and still he took it out, unfolded it, and read it again from the beginning. His mother's handwriting was small and even, leaning slightly to the right. She wrote that she didn't want her son involved in this, that she knew what he was capable of doing and didn't want him to do it, that there were other ways, and that she had chosen another way. Then she wrote that sentence, the sentence he had studied so many times that he knew by heart, even the place where the pressure of her pen had grown slightly heavier in the middle. "I left it where only one of our own would think to look." He folded the letter again. During his first year working there, he had gained access to the old personnel records room on the 19th floor, and found the file bearing her name, but all that remained was the cover sheet with the signature. The attachments had been removed long before, cleanly and neatly, as though nothing had ever been there. At 9 o'clock, the others began to arrive. Elias didn't change his clothes. He sat in the chair at the head of the long table wearing the gray janitor's uniform, the damp marks still visible around the cuffs of his pants, and he let them look at him. Gio Finucci was the first to speak. He glanced around the table, gave a contemptuous laugh, and said that for the past 3 years, while other men had carried the burden, one man had been off pushing a mop, and now the man who held that mop was sitting there intending to teach them how to conduct business. Several people lowered their eyes. Elias didn't raise his voice. He named a transportation company registered in Cranston, then gave the date it had been established, then named the person listed on its license, and explained that person's connection to Finucci's wife. He revealed how many times the payments had been broken into smaller amounts and moved through that company during the last 3 seasons, not by stating a number, but by naming every shipment one by one. He named the person who received the envelope in the permits office, named the restaurant where the envelope had been handed over, and even mentioned that they always chose the table in the far left corner because it couldn't be seen clearly from the entrance. He recited every detail, without holding a single piece of paper, without pausing even once, and from beginning to end, his voice didn't change by so much as half a note. The room grew so quiet that the ticking of the clock on the wall could be heard. Finucci rose to his feet, one hand braced against the table to steady himself. "You thought I was blind," Elias said. "I was simply standing where no one ever bothered to lower their voice. No one touched anyone. No one stepped forward." Elias told Finucci to sit down, and he sat down. Then Elias looked along the table, studying each person in turn, and he spoke the words that from that day forward would become the law of that house. The Barone family doesn't touch anyone who can't fight back. Anyone who can't abide by that can do whatever he pleases, but he must never expect anyone to stand behind him again. When he had finished speaking, Elias rose, and that gray janitor's uniform moved around the head of the table, through the doorway, and disappeared into the hall. Renata Costa was waiting for him at the end of the hallway, and she didn't rise when he approached, nor did she step aside. She had occupied a place in that house longer than he had remained there throughout the 3 years of his absence, and she wanted him to remember it. "You spoke well," she said, "but words aren't votes." She reminded him of the rules his grandfather had drafted back when such things were still written by hand, that the person who took the chair at the head of the table had to receive the support of a majority of the capos, and that according to the old custom, the matter had to be settled before the day the harbor agreement was signed, because that was the day when the entire family looked in the same direction. "You have 9 days," she said. "If you don't have enough votes by then, that chair belongs to me, and I'll sit in it without feeling guilty for even a second." Elias asked whether she intended to explain why. Renata said not yet, and she didn't say it to be mysterious. She sounded like someone holding back a card because she knew playing it now would be a waste. From that day forward, the clock began ticking inside his mind, and it didn't stop again. That night, he returned to the night shift. He put on the gray uniform again, swiped his badge at the rear entrance, pushed his cart out of the supply room, and no one in the building noticed anything unusual, because no one in the building had ever remembered his face well enough to notice anything unusual about it. Tessa was cleaning the row of glass doors in the east corridor. She saw him and stopped working, then laid the cloth on the edge of her cart. "I was going to say something," she told him. "That night, I was going to speak." Elias said he knew. She shook her head and continued, her voice quickening as though she feared that if she slowed down, she wouldn't be able to finish. She told him that she had formed the entire sentence in her mind, that all she had needed to do was open her mouth, and that she hadn't done it. She said she hadn't been able to sleep since that night. Elias propped the mop against the wall, then told her that she had remained silent so her sister could live, and that it wasn't cowardice. It was a bill, and no one blamed a person for paying a bill. Tessa stood motionless for a moment. Then she said, "You know about my sister?" He told her everyone on that floor knew, because she often made her calls in the emergency stairwell and her voice carried all the way up there. She laughed, a brief sound. And it was the first time he had ever heard her laugh. At the end of the shift, she asked whether he had eaten, and when he said he hadn't, she told him, "My place is 3 stops from here, and my sister is a terrible cook, but she has a great deal of confidence." The apartment was on the 2nd floor of an old row house near the railroad tracks. Junie Quinn was 20 years old and sat in an armchair beside the window, a thin blanket draped across her knees and a book lying face down on the armrest. The first thing she said to the stranger was to ask whether he was the man her sister always called the quiet older gentleman from the 19th floor. Elias said he probably was. Junie told him that her sister had described him as a walking filing cabinet, and now that she had met him, She thought the description was slightly unfair, but only slightly. In the corner of the room stood a machine beside an electrical outlet, its casing ivory white, and it gave off a steady whirring sound. Junie noticed him glance toward it and nodded in its direction. "The loudest roommate in this city," she said. "It snores all night, never washes a dish, and hasn't paid me a penny in rent." From the kitchen, Tessa called out for her not to frighten their guest. Junie said she wasn't frightening him. She was introducing him to a member of the household. They ate noodles with eggs and a few vegetables left in the refrigerator, served on 3 mismatched plates, and Junie told stories about the dialysis center. She spoke of an elderly man who sat in the chair beside hers and told the same story every week about going out to sea when he was young, except the fish grew larger every time he told it. She imitated the way the old man spread his arms wide, and Tessa laughed so hard that she had to put down her fork. No one in that room said a single word about hardship. Near the end of the meal, Junie asked whether her sister had sent the paperwork yet. Tessa said she would send it tomorrow. Junie explained to Elias, her voice still as light as though she were talking about the weather, that she was undergoing evaluation to be placed on the kidney transplant waiting list, and that besides the medical portion, the center also required another part, the paperwork. They needed proof that after the transplant, the patient would be able to keep taking the medication required to prevent rejection over the long term, because if someone received a transplant but couldn't get the medicine, that kidney would be lost. "So," she said, "my sister Tessa works 2 jobs, and the employee badge in her pocket is worth more than gold." She said it with a smile, reached for another piece of bread, and immediately changed the subject. But Elias had grown very still. He watched Tessa lower her head as she poured the water, watched those cracked hands, and he understood that on the night she had stood behind the service cart and hadn't opened her mouth, she hadn't been choosing between courage and cowardice. She had been choosing between a single sentence and her sister's life. The following morning, he went straight from the night shift to the bank, and he didn't go home to change because Sloane had arranged an appointment with the notary, and he didn't want to reschedule it. The branch stood on a quiet street behind City Hall, the kind of bank that displayed no advertisements in its windows, with terrazzo floors, leather chairs, and the unmistakable smell of new paper. Elias walked in wearing his gray uniform, his shoes still damp, and he immediately sensed that the entire room had changed the rhythm of its breathing. The woman at the reception desk stopped typing. A man waiting in the row of chairs folded his newspaper and placed it on his lap. Elias approached the desk and said he had an appointment to sign some documents concerning a trust. Marguerite Hale, who was attending the reception desk that morning, asked whom his appointment was with, and when he gave her the name, she stared at the screen a little longer than necessary before telling him to wait. He waited. 10 minutes later, she returned, and this time, her voice had changed. She asked whether he had any identification. He handed it to her. She asked whether he had a card from the bank. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out a black card, and placed it on the counter. She stared at it the way someone might stare at an object that had just fallen from the ceiling. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands, then set it down and lowered her voice, though not quite enough. "Where did you get this?" she asked. Elias said it was his card. Marguerite told him that the number of those cards in the entire city could be counted on one hand, that she knew the face of every person who possessed one, and that none of them came in at 7 o'clock in the morning with the cuffs of their pants still damp. He said he had just finished his shift. She said she understood, that she understood perfectly, and then she went on to tell him that if he stood up and walked out now, the matter would end there, but if he remained seated, she would have no choice but to call the police, and once that happened, there would be nothing more she could do to help him. 2 security guards had taken their places at opposite ends of the counter. Elias didn't stand. He told her to make the call. Marguerite picked up the telephone. She had dialed only 2 digits when the glass door at the back opened, and Sloane Pryor entered with a file tucked beneath one arm. She walked directly across the middle of the room without looking at anyone and said, "Forgive me. The traffic was terrible." Then she turned toward the counter and asked where the branch manager was. 30 seconds later, the branch manager was standing there, his tie still not properly adjusted, addressing Elias by the very last name everyone in the room had just heard, and apologizing 3 times in a single sentence. Marguerite was still holding the receiver. She lowered it very slowly, as though it would shatter if she set it down too hard. The branch manager turned to her and told her to gather her belongings, and he said it in the voice of a man trying to win someone's favor. Marguerite didn't argue. She straightened her back and said that she had 2 children and a mortgage, and that if this reason appeared in her employment record, she would never be hired by another bank, not anywhere in the industry. She spoke to the floor, not to anyone in the room. Elias rose. He picked up the card from the counter, slipped it into his pocket, then told the branch manager that he didn't want anyone dismissed over what had happened that morning, and that if he heard otherwise the following day, he would transfer every document to another branch before the week was over. The branch manager nodded repeatedly. Marguerite raised her eyes to Elias and asked why. "You looked at the uniform instead of my face," Elias said. "This entire city does the same thing. I can't fire an entire city." He signed the documents in the room at the back. It took less than half an hour, and when he emerged, Marguerite was still standing in the same place. She opened the door for him, and neither of them said another word. That night, after returning to the 19th floor, he opened the old personnel records room as he did once every week, expecting nothing. The act having become almost a habit, the upper drawer still held files arranged alphabetically, but this time, when he pulled the bottom drawer all the way out, he saw a hardbound register lying at an angle in the back, its cloth spine worn with age, so thick that every page had to be turned before anyone could see all it contained. On the cover was a faded line of printed lettering identifying it as the loss prevention log. He turned through several pages. Inside were handwritten entries in many different hands, extending across years. He didn't find his mother's name on any of the pages he opened, so he closed the drawer and moved on. In the 3 years he had worked in that building, he had never once paid attention to that register, simply because it didn't bear her name. Sloane arrived at the brownstone that afternoon carrying a file case thicker than usual, and she didn't sit down immediately, nor did she accept the cup of coffee he poured for her. She opened the case, removed a stack of papers, and began spreading them across the long table, one sheet at a time, arranging them in 2 orderly rows until they covered nearly its entire length. The paper was heavy and embossed, with the company logo printed at the top of every page. "Have you read them?" she asked. Elias said he had read the summaries she sent him every month, and he had approved and signed the responses, but he had never read the original letters. Sloane told him that today he should read them. For the past year, the Ashby-Vaughan Corporation had been pursuing the purchase of the central parcel on the waterfront, the piece of land without which the entire project was nothing more than a beautiful drawing hanging in a conference room. They knew the property belonged to a private trust. They didn't know who stood behind the trust, because the law allowed that identity to remain undisclosed, and Sloane had never revealed it. So throughout that year, every communication had been conducted through letters sent to her office, addressed to someone the entire corporation referred to by 3 words: the authorized trustee. Elias picked up the top sheet. He read the first line, then stopped and turned to the bottom of the page. There, beneath the company representative's signature, was a name he had seen on the shared mailbox outside his apartment for 7 years. Sloane said nothing. She allowed him to make his way through that discovery alone. He read the first letter, then the second, and after that he stopped reading them in order and began picking up one sheet and then another. Meredith wrote beautifully. He had always known she wrote well, but in the past 3 years he hadn't read a single line she had written. In those letters, she thanked the authorized trustee for taking the time to consider the matter. She wrote that whether the trustee was a woman or a man, she didn't know, but that person was clearly deeply attached to the land, and such devotion deserved respect, rather than being treated as an obstacle. In one letter, she wrote that her company was willing to wait another season if necessary, because some decisions shouldn't be rushed. Another letter, written near the end of winter, began with an inquiry about the recipient's health during the bitter cold, and the words didn't sound like a mere courtesy. By the time he reached the final letter, darkness had fallen. During the past 3 years they had lived together. She had spoken to him mostly about schedules, bills, and remembering to lock the door downstairs, and he knew those sentences by heart as well. "You're keeping all of these?" Sloane asked. "The originals are supposed to remain in the official records." Elias told her to make copies for the files, but he would keep the originals. She asked why. He arranged them into a single stack, gently tapped the edges against the tabletop until they were even, and said they were the only kind words she had written to him in 3 years, even though she hadn't known who she was writing to. Sloane didn't respond to that. She removed another sheet from her case, and her voice shifted completely into the tone she used for business. "Preston Vaughan's side has just lost a line of credit," she said. No reason was given, and none will be. They simply chose not to renew it. Elias asked how he had reacted. Sloane said he had called 3 institutions in a single morning, that all 3 had been exceedingly polite, and that none of them could answer his question about why it had happened, because they didn't know either. Then she added that by the end of the week, one of the partner banks would quietly withdraw from the deal. There would be no press conference, no written notice, only a name disappearing from the list in the next update. And that was when the other side would begin to feel the cold. They drove down toward the harbor after darkness had fully settled. Sloane asked whether he wanted to move faster, because if he did, she could make it happen. All she needed were 2 telephone calls, and every source of financing available to Ashby Vaughn would be frozen within a week. Elias looked out the car window at the row of yellow lights stretching along the docks, and he told her not to tighten the grip all at once. Tighten it little by little. Give him time to hear the wood cracking. Sloane remained silent for a moment, then asked whether he was certain, because that way would be slower, and moving slowly required time, while time was the one thing he didn't have. He said he knew. People don't fear the collapse, he said. They fear what is about to collapse. And when a man begins to feel afraid, he searches for something to hold on to. And only then will I be able to see clearly who is standing beside whom in that building. She asked whom he wanted to see. He didn't answer. Sloane called him before 7 o'clock the next morning, and she didn't bother with a greeting. They all pulled out, she said. Elias asked who. She told him that 2 accounting firms had withdrawn, along with the entire tax law team and the company that had always handled the permitting paperwork for the cargo contracts. No one offered an explanation. They simply said they were suspending their involvement while there was internal uncertainty, and all 3 firms used those exact words, internal uncertainty. On the same evening, Elias asked what she still had. Sloane said she still had herself, delivering the words in a dry voice, and then she added that Renata had done this very cleanly. She hadn't threatened anyone or promised anyone anything. She had merely called to ask how they were doing, and allowed them to draw their own conclusions. And that was the method of someone who had occupied a place in that house longer than anyone else remaining there. Elias said nothing for a while. Then he told Sloane not to call anyone, not to negotiate with anyone, and to leave everything as it was until the afternoon. She asked what he intended to do. He said he was going down to the harbor. At noon, he went on foot. He didn't take a car, and he didn't bring anyone with him. He was still wearing the gray work uniform because he had come straight from the night shift, and he walked down the slope toward Pier 4 with both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. Pier 4 was the longest pier, the one reserved for heavy cargo, where engines were always roaring and metal was always striking metal, where people had to shout to hear one another. He walked through the gate, nodded to the man on duty, and continued into the middle of the yard. The first person to see him was a cable rigger standing on a platform, and the man turned and said something to the worker beside him. Then that worker turned to the next person. The crane that had been lifting a container over the pier stopped halfway, leaving the cargo suspended in the air, and the operator leaned out of his cab to look down. In less than a minute, all of Pier 4 had fallen still. 400 people turned to look in the same direction, and not one of them looked because he was afraid. They looked because the Barone name had appeared in the Union Charter since before Elias's grandfather could read English, because their fathers and grandfathers had signed their names or pressed their thumbprints beneath that charter, because during the winters when there was no work, it hadn't been the city government that kept the stoves burning in that neighborhood. Elias didn't climb onto a platform or pick up a loudspeaker. He walked toward the 2 crews standing opposite each other at the head of the pier, a dispute that had been going on for several days, because one crew had been given all the profitable night shifts, while the other had been pushed onto the smaller, irregular shipments, and the men on the 2 sides had stopped eating lunch together. He asked who assigned the shifts. One man stepped forward. Elias asked whether the schedule from the previous month still existed. The man said it did. Elias told him that starting the following week, anyone working night shifts that month would receive no night shifts the next month. The assignments would rotate. The schedule would be posted at the gate for everyone to read, and anyone who found something wrong with it could come to him instead of confronting one another. He spoke 3 sentences. No more. Then he remained there a little longer to make certain no one had anything else to say. And no one did. The crane began moving again. Elias walked toward the far end of the pier, to a place sheltered from the wind behind a row of containers, and took out his telephone. He called a man he hadn't contacted in many years, an elderly attorney who was almost entirely retired and lived in the suburbs. A man whose career Elias's grandfather had once saved by vouching for him in a case that otherwise would have ended that career before it had even begun. Elias didn't mention the past. He only said that he needed people, that he needed them immediately, and that he needed people who wouldn't be intimidated by anyone's telephone call. The other end of the line remained silent for several seconds. Then the man asked how many he needed, and Elias said he needed enough. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Sloane called again and told him that 3 teams had just accepted the work, including one she had previously tried and failed to hire, and that beginning the next morning, every tax file and permitting matter would be under new management. She said she didn't know whom he had called, and she wasn't asking. He told her not to ask. Then she was silent for a moment, before saying what they both knew, but neither had yet spoken aloud. "You got the people working again," she said, "but you didn't get the votes back." Elias looked out across the water, watching the crane lower the container, and said he knew. Old favors could buy the loyalty of those indebted by them, but the capos owed nothing to anyone. They owed only themselves, and what they wanted to know wasn't whom he could call, but where he intended to lead them once he took that chair. Renata knew that. She had known it from the beginning, and she wasn't in any hurry. Elias ended the call, stood watching a little longer, then walked back up the slope toward the city streets, while inside his mind, the clock kept ticking. Tessa noticed it before Elias did, and she noticed it in the way of someone accustomed to living with few choices. It began at the laundromat where she worked the morning shift. A gray car was parked at an angle across the street, and it was there on Tuesday, then there again on Thursday, and both times the person inside never got out to buy anything from the row of stores. She didn't tell anyone. She simply changed the time she left work, walked 2 extra blocks before boarding the bus, and that evening, the gray car passed the bus stop she had just left. The next day, she changed routes and went around by the hospital, then paused in front of a pharmacy window to watch the reflection behind her. And the figure in that reflection stopped as well. She didn't run. She went inside the pharmacy, stood at the counter farthest from the door, waited long enough, then walked back out and wrote down the license plate number on the back of a laundromat receipt still tucked inside her pocket, using the pencil she carried to mark the shift schedule. She did it with a perfectly steady hand. 3 nights later, on the 19th floor, she handed the receipt to Elias. "Someone has been following me," she said, "since Tuesday of last week. You keep this. If something happens, you'll know what to give the authorities." Elias didn't ask whether she was certain. He merely took the paper, studied the row of numbers written in pencil, then asked what the man looked like. She described him as a man somewhere in his 40s, wearing a canvas coat, making no attempt to hide his face. Once, he had even nodded to her at the bus stop. Elias asked her to describe that nod again. She said it was the way someone might greet a coworker. Elias folded the receipt, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, and told her to continue going to work as usual, not to change routes again, and not to let the man know that she knew. She asked what he could possibly do. He said he knew a few people. There was nothing unusual in his voice when he said it, and later, when she looked back, she would remember that this was precisely what she should have noticed. The following morning, Dale Mercer was sitting in the coffee shop on the corner near the old streetcar stop, where he sat around that same hour every day, when a man pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without asking. Mercer looked up and recognized the gray uniform before he recognized the face. Elias didn't greet him. He ordered a cup of black coffee, waited until the server had walked away, then spoke the name of Mercer's wife, the name of the street where they rented their home, and the name of the place Mercer visited on Friday nights, the one in the basement behind an auto repair shop. Mercer lowered his cup. "You owe money to a place whose owner is one of my people," Elias said. "Next week, that debt agreement will be in my desk drawer. You resign before noon today, or we'll meet again next week. I never threaten anyone. I inform them." Mercer said he was merely working for someone else. Elias said he knew. Mercer said he had 2 children in school. Elias said he knew that too, and he said it in exactly the same voice he had used when speaking about the debt. No louder, no softer, not even half a beat faster. Then he stood, left money for the coffee on the table, and walked out. Outside, less than 2 steps from the glass door, Tessa was standing still. She hadn't intended to come there. She was on her way to her morning shift, and the coffee shop happened to be along her route. She had seen the gray uniform through the glass and stopped out of curiosity, and she had remained close enough for long enough. She heard everything from the moment he mentioned the debt. She also heard what he said about the 2 children. What sent a chill down her spine wasn't what he said, but the way he said it. She had heard people threaten one another in real life. They usually raised their voices, pointed their fingers, and turned red in the face. The man inside did none of those things. The voice he used to speak about the debt and the voice he used to speak about the 2 children were the same voice, and it was the voice he always used when asking whether she had brought another dry cloth. Tessa stepped back once, then she took another step, turned, and walked straight away, faster than necessary, without looking back. There was no clear thought in her mind then, only one question repeating itself over and over, asking who the man who had eaten noodles at her kitchen table, the man who had laughed when Junie reenacted the old sailor's story, truly was. Elias stepped out of the coffee shop and turned in the opposite direction, never knowing that she had been standing there. That night, Tessa didn't say anything to him during the first half of their shift. She worked faster than usual, remaining some distance ahead of him, and every time he pushed the service cart close to where she was, she had already moved on to another corridor. Elias noticed, but he didn't ask because he assumed she was tired. It was around 3 o'clock when they both returned to the janitorial supply room at the end of the 19th floor to empty the dirty water and collect more towels, that she finally spoke, and she did so by asking a question that seemed to have nothing to do with anything. "You've worked here for 3 years. Have you ever opened that bottom cabinet?" He said he hadn't. She pulled open the door of the old metal cabinet, reached behind a stack of folded towels, and drew out a spiral notebook. Its blue cover had faded almost entirely to gray. Several loops of the binding were bent in the middle, and the edges of the pages had thickened and swollen from the dampness of many seasons. She placed it on the makeshift table between 2 buckets. "This belongs to us," she said. Elias opened it. The first page he saw was written in her handwriting, in blue ink, with the date in the left margin followed by a series of brief entries. 19th floor, on duty from 10 o'clock. Broken glass in East Conference Room, cleaned up. 2 maintenance workers came upstairs just before 1 o'clock. Went back down at 1:30. Coffee machine on the 17th floor leaking, reported. He turned several more pages and saw the handwriting change. First to larger letters slanting in the opposite direction, then to another hand entirely. She stood beside him, with her arms folded across her chest, and explained in the same calm voice she might have used to discuss replacing a light bulb. "No one makes us keep this," she said. "The company doesn't require it, and neither does the building. We do it ourselves. Because when something goes missing in this building, try to guess who they call in first. Not the men in suits who stay late. Not the guests. They call the people who carry the keys and enter every room when no one else is there. They call us." She said people didn't need evidence to become suspicious. All they needed was a name and a work shift. So the only way to protect themselves was to write down where they had been every night, at what time, and who had passed through. If something happened, they opened the notebook. It was their only shield, and it was a shield made of paper, and they had been using it for a very long time. Elias was still holding the notebook. He asked whether anyone had ever taken it away for inspection. Tessa gave a short laugh and said that in all the time she had worked there, not one person from the upper floors had ever set foot in that supply room. Not management, not human resources, not security. People knew the room existed in the same way they knew the building had plumbing, but no one ever thought to open its door. "To them, this isn't a room," she said. "It's the place where everything dirty gets taken away." Elias asked how long she had been keeping the notebook. 2 years, she said. "Since the woman who worked here before me left. She handed it to me during her final shift and told me to write in it regularly. That was all." He asked how long the notebook had existed, and when he asked that question, his voice changed. It didn't become louder or faster, but something seemed to withdraw from it, and Tessa raised her eyes to him because, for the first time in 3 years, she heard that difference. She said she didn't know exactly. The woman before her had said the notebook was already thick when she received it. According to what she had heard, it had been there since before the building installed the glass elevator on its facade, back when shift schedules were still written in pencil. She said she thought the earlier notebooks were somewhere in the cabinet as well, stacked one on top of another, but she wasn't sure. Then she added something in an entirely ordinary voice, as though it were some insignificant detail that deserved no further thought. "I've kept it for 2 years and written in it every night, but I've never gone back through the older pages. Who would ever read backward through something like that?" Elias stood perfectly still. He stood in the middle of that supply room, surrounded by the smell of bleach and damp cloth, one hand still resting on the notebook's cover, and he said nothing. Beyond the door, the ventilation system hummed in the corridor, and somewhere in the sink, water was dripping. Tessa asked what was wrong. He didn't answer immediately. He closed the notebook very slowly, placed it on the table, and pushed it toward her. Then he told her to put it away, to return it to the same place, and not to let it leave that room. She studied him for another moment, then reached behind the stack of towels, slipped the notebook back into its hiding place, and closed the metal cabinet. The hinge made a dry creaking sound in the small room. When they returned to the corridor, Elias walked more slowly than usual, and for the rest of that night shift, he didn't say another word. The truth broke open on Monday morning, when the finance department at Ashby Vaughan discovered that a large sum had been withdrawn from the escrow account reserved for the waterfront deal, an amount so substantial that it couldn't be concealed through another reporting period. An emergency meeting was called that same morning, and by noon, the entire building knew, in the way every building eventually knows everything. The technical team presented the only thing they had, a single entry from the system log. The transfer had been authorized from a workstation in the office area on the 19th floor at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. In the conference room that day, when those words appeared on the screen, someone said aloud what everyone was thinking, that at such an hour, there was only one kind of person on the 19th floor, and no one objected. Meredith Rowe stood as soon as the presentation ended. She didn't mention the path the money had taken. She spoke about something else, something she believed was the matter that truly deserved attention. She reminded them that within the past 10 days, a line of credit had been closed without anyone being able to explain why. Then a partner bank had quietly vanished from the list in the next update. Then 2 more consulting firms had withdrawn with letters so polite they were meaningless. She said that when so many things happened one after another within so few days, it could no longer be called coincidence. Then she spoke her husband's name. She said that this man had been escorted out of the building in front of 200 guests, that he was inside the building during hours when no one supervised him, that he knew the building better than most of the people sitting in that conference room, and that he was the only person in the world with a reason to want the project dead. She didn't use the word theft. She used the word sabotage. And the irony, which she wouldn't discover until much later, was that she was right. Preston Vaughan sat at the head of the table throughout that meeting and said very little. He merely proposed tightening the procedures governing access to the building at night, and he said it in the voice of a man struggling to remain calm in the middle of a crisis, and everyone believed he was being reasonable. That afternoon, Sloane brought a thin file to the brownstone. She didn't present it to any counsel, and she didn't send it to anyone. She had asked 2 people outside the organization to trace the movement of the money throughout the weekend, and she spread their findings before Elias. The trail passed through 3 places before stopping somewhere that anyone could understand at a glance. The money hadn't gone far. It had merely moved from one pocket to another, belonging to the same man, and that man had been sitting at the head of the conference table that morning. Sloane said Preston's deposit had been due the previous season, that he had already spent it, and now that the deadline had arrived, he had taken the money from the escrow account to cover the missing amount. She said she could release the evidence at any time. Elias didn't respond. He was holding the first page from the file, the one reproducing the system log entry, and he was staring at the time recorded there. He studied it for a very long while. Then he placed the page neatly on the table and said nothing. Sloane waited. She waited longer than she had ever waited for anyone. Outside the window, a car passed, and then everything fell silent. At last, he said only one thing, that she shouldn't reveal the evidence yet. She asked why. Because it could bring the entire matter to an end in a single afternoon. He said that revealing it now would prove only that Preston had taken the money. It wouldn't prove anything else. Sloane asked what else he wanted to prove. He didn't answer. At the glass building that evening, Meredith stayed late. She had read the summary that the finance department had sent privately to the executive team, a version more complete than the one presented that morning, and it contained one small detail about where the money trail had ended. She read it twice. Then she turned off her screen. Preston entered her office at nearly 9 o'clock, rested one hand on the back of her chair, and told her that the past few days had been difficult but would soon pass, that he needed her to remain strong, and that the 2 of them were about to enter the most important stage of all. She raised her eyes to him. She had exactly 1 moment, and she knew she had it. Then she said she understood, reached for her coat, and walked with him toward the elevator. Preston Vaughn needed a name, and he needed it before the board meeting on Wednesday, because when money disappeared and no one accepted responsibility, people would eventually keep searching until they found someone, and he couldn't allow them to search. The night shift schedule was kept in the personnel records, and on that schedule, beside the line for the 19th floor, there was a name. Tessa Quinn was summoned to the Human Resources office in the middle of Tuesday afternoon, just after she had finished her shift at the laundromat and before she had time to go home. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. The person sitting across from her read a prepared statement containing the phrase, "serious violation of internal security regulations," and the phrase, "immediate termination of employment with the cleaning service contractor." She asked what she had done. They told her that the decision had come from above, and that Human Resources was merely carrying it out. She said, "I wrote everything down. I wrote it down every night. Go and check." They said that wouldn't be necessary. She asked whether she was allowed to speak. They pushed a sheet of paper and a pen toward her, pointed to the space where she was expected to acknowledge receipt, and told her that whether she signed it or not, the decision would still take effect. Throughout the entire meeting, no one asked her a single question. Her access badge was taken from her immediately. Someone accompanied her to the janitorial supply room to collect her personal belongings, stood outside the door watching as she folded her coat and picked up her plastic cup, then escorted her all the way to the rear entrance. 2 days later, the transplant center sent a letter. It stated that because of a change in the sponsor's employment status, Junie Quinn's application had been temporarily removed from the evaluation process, and that the family could submit it again once their financial circumstances had been re-established. The letter was very polite. It didn't use a single harsh word. That same week, in the ground floor corridor of the glass building, Preston stopped Elias. Elias was leaving after signing the final transfer documents with the cleaning company when Preston emerged from the elevators and blocked the middle of the passage, both hands tucked into his pockets. He said he knew who Elias was, that he knew Elias was still lingering around the building, and that he wanted to make something clear once and for all. He said they had been kind to Elias when they merely escorted him outside, instead of doing anything further. He said the building was bigger than Elias, bigger than all his petty affairs, and that if Elias came near it again, they wouldn't be so polite the next time. He added several remarks about how some people were born to hold pens while others were born to hold rags, speaking slowly and savoring every word because he was having a very bad week, and this was the only place in that entire week where he still felt he stood above someone else. Elias listened to everything. He didn't answer with a single word. When Preston had finished and stepped back half a pace, as though waiting to see whether Elias intended to argue, Elias finally spoke, and he asked only one question. He asked whether Preston still remembered the woman who had once worked on the 19th floor, the one who, many years earlier, had also been escorted out through the front door in broad daylight. He didn't say her name. He didn't say anything else. Preston opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The blood drained from his face in a way he couldn't understand quickly enough, because there was no clear thought in his mind at that moment, only the cold sensation of a man who had just heard footsteps inside a house where he had believed himself alone. Elias walked around him and went out through the door. That afternoon, in the old building near the railroad tracks, Tessa didn't go upstairs immediately. She sat on the metal fire escape at the back of the building, where she often sat to make telephone calls, with the bag containing her personal belongings resting on her lap. Inside the bag were a coat, a plastic cup, a jar of hand ointment, and the paper they had given her to sign. She held the bag in both arms, bowed her head, and remained there for a very long time. Above her, beyond the second-floor window, a machine hummed steadily, and Junie was waiting for her to come home so she could ask how her day had gone. Tessa would have to go upstairs. She would have to open the door, smile, and say that everything was all right, but not yet. She spoke very softly, to no one at all. I wasn't even allowed to answer a single question, this time either, just like before. Renata Costa came to the brownstone without warning that evening, carrying a file case that she placed on the table but didn't open. Elias poured her a glass of wine. She didn't drink it, and she sat with her back straight in the chair beside the window, like someone who had come to finish something that had been postponed for far too long. "When were you planning to tell me?" she asked. He told her to be more specific. Renata said she didn't intend to speak in circles, and she didn't have as much time as he did, so she would say it plainly. She knew about the trust. She knew whose name stood behind the central waterfront parcel, and she knew how long it had been held that way. She knew that during the past 3 years, he hadn't been hiding. He had been learning something, and she could guess what he had been learning. Then she spoke the truth that no one in that house had yet said aloud. "You intend to dissolve it," she said. "Not withdraw, not transfer control. You intend to close this house for good, turn everything that remains into legitimate companies with proper books, audits, and people who pay taxes. And you intend to do it during your first term. Correct me if any part of that is wrong." Elias didn't correct her. He set down his own glass of wine without drinking and said yes. Renata gave a single nod, as though she had just closed a drawer. Then she continued, and there was no triumph in her voice at all, which made everything she said feel heavier. She asked whether he knew how many workers at Pier 4 lived in homes where no one else earned a paycheck. He said he knew there were many. She said no. "You don't know, because you read payroll records, but you haven't gone from home to home and asked." "I have. For the past 3 years, I've done the work you weren't here to do," she said. She began naming people. The cable rigger whose wife had been confined to bed since the previous autumn, the family living in the row of houses at the end of the street, with 3 young children and a mortgage they barely managed to pay every month. The man who was 47 years old, knew no trade except this one, had no qualifications, and carried a single line in his record that prevented anyone else from hiring him. She spoke slowly and named only a few, just enough for him to understand that she knew those names by heart and hadn't looked them up. Then she told him that when he closed that house, the cargo contracts would disappear with it, and when those contracts disappeared, the union would become nothing more than a charter hanging on a wall, and once the union was nothing but a piece of paper, someone else would arrive at Pier 4 within a single season and do the work for less. 400 people, she said. Not 400 numbers on a payroll sheet. 400 kitchens. Elias said he would make preparations. Renata asked with what, for how long, and with whose money, delivering all 3 questions in one breath without allowing him to answer any of them. Then she said she had occupied a place in that house longer than he had, and she had watched many decent men come and go, and decent men always destroyed things faster than everyone else, not because they were cruel, but because they were impatient. They saw something right and wanted to do it immediately, without counting how many people were standing between them and that righteous thing. Elias opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no answer. It was the first time during those days, and for many years before them, that he had sat across from someone with nothing to say. Renata saw it, and she didn't take advantage of it. She simply waited. At last, he asked what she wanted. She said she wanted the chair, and she said it plainly, without dressing the truth in prettier words. She told him that if she sat in that chair, she wouldn't dissolve anything. She would preserve everything exactly as it was, and she understood clearly what that meant, and she accepted it. She said she didn't believe she was right. She only believed that when choosing between doing the right thing too soon and allowing the wrong thing to continue for another 10 years, she would choose the second, because people would still survive the second. She rose, picked up the file case she had never opened, and when she reached the door, she turned back. "If you find a way for both sides to remain standing, I'll cast my vote for you that very day," she said. "But you have to find it." The door closed. Elias remained alone in the room, and now the problem stood before him in its full shape, clear and without any shortcut. He needed the waterfront deal to survive. If he exposed Ashby Vaughn and brought it down, the project would die with it, and those 400 kitchens would grow cold before anyone had time to ask why. But if he allowed it to survive, he would also have to allow the people who had taken his mother's name from her to remain seated on the highest floor of that building. He sat there for a very long time, until the wine on the table had grown warm and daylight began to break outside. He waited for her in the underground parking garage beneath the building, beside pillar number 2, where she had parked ever since receiving her promotion. Meredith came out at nearly 7 o'clock that evening, her briefcase held beneath one arm and her keys in the other hand, and she stopped when she saw him standing there. She looked around before speaking, casting one swift glance toward the elevators, and he noticed it but said nothing. "You shouldn't be here," she told him. He said he only needed 5 minutes. She opened the trunk, placed her briefcase inside, closed it, and said that if this concerned the documents, he could send them through the legal department, and if it concerned anything else, she didn't want to hear it. He said it concerned something else. Then he told her. He said that the central parcel on the waterfront, the piece without which the entire plan hanging in her conference room, was nothing more than a picture, didn't belong to anyone in her company. It belonged to a trust. He said that for the past year, her company had been writing letters to that trust, that those letters had been sent to a law office behind City Hall, and he gave her the name of that office. He told her the name of the authorized trustee. Then he said, "The ground beneath your feet has belonged to me from the beginning." She laughed. She laughed before he had finished the sentence, the sound escaping her throat the instant he began to say the word me, and it came so quickly that it arrived before the meaning of his words had even reached her. Then she regained her rhythm and continued laughing. More slowly this time, more completely. The kind of laugh people used when they wanted the person before them to know they were being laughed at. "Do you know what the worst part is?" she said. "It isn't that you're lying, it's that you're so bad at it." She said she had heard many men lie in her lifetime, and the clever ones invented small things, things that were difficult to verify, while only men who had lost everything invented the grandest lies. She said he hadn't been able to endure what happened that night, and she understood, and she even pitied him, but standing in a parking garage and claiming to own a parcel of land worth as much as an entire building was no longer about wounded pride. She asked whether he knew how long it had taken her to earn her place on the floors above, and she said it had taken all those years, a little at a time, and no one had ever given her anything for free. But all he had to do was stand there for 10 minutes and say one sentence. Elias allowed her to finish. He didn't interrupt her once. When she fell silent, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, removed a card, and held it out to her. It wasn't large. The paper was heavy and embossed, and there were few words printed on it. It was a private invitation to the signing ceremony for the waterfront deal, with the guest's name written by hand. Meredith took it and looked at it exactly once. She looked at the name, looked at the seal, then raised her eyes to him and asked where he had made it, on the street or online. She said people could produce such things very cheaply now. She said it didn't even have an embedded security strip in the corner, and she tilted it beneath the garage lights to prove her point, but the light was yellow and weak, and she couldn't see anything at all, and she took her inability to see anything as proof of what she had just said. Then she slipped it into the pocket of her coat. She didn't look at it a second time. He told her to keep it. She said she would throw it into the trash can on the corner. He said that was her choice, but she should come on that day, and if she came, she wouldn't have to listen to him say another word, because someone else would speak for him. She asked what he wanted from her, what he honestly wanted. He remained silent for a moment, then said he wanted her to be there. That was all. Meredith opened the car door and sat down, and before closing it, she said one final thing. She said she would call the legal department the next morning, and if he waited for her there one more time, there would be a formal notice. She said it very calmly. Then the car door closed. The headlights came on and swept across his legs, and the car backed out of its space, turned up the ramp, and disappeared toward the garage exit. Elias remained there for a moment in that yellow light, surrounded by the smell of concrete and engine oil, then walked toward the stairwell because no one else used it. After the escrow money disappeared, Preston brought in an outside security company to take control of the entire building, and the transition list contained one brief line stating that Walt Kozak had been placed on temporary leave pending an internal review. So that night, the people patrolling the glass building were all strangers, wearing unfamiliar uniforms and carrying newly printed floor plans, and they followed routes generated by a computer, instead of the habits of those who had worked there for years. Elias and Tessa met at the corner behind the building at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. Both of their access badges had been deactivated the previous week. But at the loading dock entrance, the old metal door through which the trash bins were pushed every night still had a mechanical lock, and its key remained on the ring kept by the cleaning crew, and no one in human resources had thought to retrieve that ring because, throughout all those years, no one had ever concerned themselves with the keys carried by the cleaners. Tessa opened the door with both hands, lifting it 0.5 centimeter before turning it, because she knew the bottom hinge was misaligned and would creak if she didn't raise it first. Inside, it was dark and warm, and the familiar smell of the trash bins made her feel strangely relieved. The plan was very simple, which was precisely why it could fail. They wouldn't remove anything. They would only photograph every page, leave the notebook exactly where it was, and at daybreak, Sloan would serve an evidence preservation order on the entire building. If they did it the other way around, If Preston learned that the notebook existed before the order was served, it would disappear within 10 minutes, and no court in the world would accept photographs of something that no longer existed. They climbed the service stairs, the narrow staircase running through the building's core, where the walls were painted gray and pipes ran parallel to the handrail. Tessa went first, counting the landings with her fingertips against the wall. Somewhere between the 15th and 16th floors, they heard footsteps descending from above. Both of them stopped. There was nowhere to hide on that staircase. A flashlight beam swept down the steps, paused, then lowered to illuminate their feet instead of their faces. The man holding it was Walt Kozak. He wore an ordinary coat instead of a uniform, and he carried no radio. The three of them remained motionless for the span of 3 breaths. Then Walt lowered the light completely. "I knew you still had the keys," he said to Tessa. "I also guessed it would be tonight." He said the new security team didn't know the lower door had a mechanical lock, and on the plans they had printed, that entrance was marked as a service access point with no guard assigned to it. He said they would pass through the 19th floor at 1:45, and if Elias and Tessa intended to go, they needed to go now. Elias didn't move. He looked at the man standing 2 steps above him, and during his 3 years in that building, every time he had passed the security desk, he had thought about what he would do to Walt. He had thought about it very carefully. He knew where Walt lived, knew where he had borrowed money, and knew who controlled the pension benefits Walt was supposed to receive in another 2 years. He had arranged every detail in his mind long ago. "You know who I am," he said. Walt nodded. "For 2 years," he replied. He said he hadn't recognized Elias by his face. He had recognized him by the silver ring. He said he had seen that ring many times on another hand, in the corridor above, during the early mornings when Walt was beginning his first shift and she was preparing to leave. Then he continued in an even voice, making no attempt to defend himself. He said that throughout those 2 years, he had been the person who prepared the shift schedules, and he had assigned Elias to the 19th floor every month, and whenever Elias stayed beyond his hours, Walt hadn't asked questions, and he had allowed the security footage near the records room to overwrite itself, according to its normal cycle. He said he hadn't been able to do anything more. Elias said nothing. The only sound on the staircase was the faint noise inside the pipes. He already had a sentence waiting in his mind, one he had constructed and sharpened since his first year there, and now it remained exactly where he had left it, intact, and all he had to do was open his mouth. He thought of the long table inside the brownstone, and remembered his own voice declaring that law before everyone, those who couldn't fight back. He looked at Walt's 2 hands, the hands of a man approaching retirement, holding a flashlight that had gone dark. Then he asked whether Walt had ever entered the janitorial supply room at the end of the 19th floor. Walt raised his head slightly, not understanding. He said no. He said he worked in security, patrolled the corridors, and checked the doors, and there had never been any reason for him to go inside that room. Elias told him to go ahead, take his position at the top of the stairs on the 18th floor, and help him, and if he saw a light coming up from below, he should knock twice against the handrail. Walt studied him for 1 more second. Then he turned and continued upward. The janitorial supply room was dark and cramped, and they didn't dare turn on the ceiling light, so Tessa placed a small flashlight upright inside an overturned bucket, allowing the beam to strike the ceiling and spread evenly down through the room. Elias pulled the notebook from its hiding place behind the stack of towels, set it on the makeshift table, and opened it to the first page. The page's deepest inside had faded to the color of ivory, and the ink was darker in some places and lighter in others, depending on who had written the entry, while the margins bore round stains left by the bottoms of cups during winters long past. He had turned only a few pages when the telephone in his pocket vibrated. He looked at the screen. Tessa followed his gaze. It was the hospital. He answered and said only yes, then yes again, then thank you, and ended the call. Junie's blood pressure dropped after her dialysis session earlier today, he said. They've just taken her to the emergency room. For 1 moment, Tessa didn't breathe. Then, at that same instant, 2 dry knocks sounded against the metal handrail at the bottom of the service stairs, the noise traveling upward along the pipes, and immediately afterward, a wash of white light swept across the narrow gap beneath the door. Elias straightened. He was still holding the notebook. 3 things occupied his mind at once. There was the hospital, there was the light beyond the door, and there was the telephone in his pocket, with which he needed only to make 1 call and speak 1 sentence to someone at the harbor, and within half a minute, the transformer station supplying that entire block would suffer a failure. The whole building would go dark, and not one security guard would be able to reach the 19th floor that night. He had done things like that before. He knew exactly which number to call. He didn't call it. He handed the notebook to Tessa. "From the first page to the last," he said. "When you've photographed everything, return it to exactly where it was. Don't take it out of this room." She took it and told him to go. He paused at the door for half a second. Then he left, and the sound of his footsteps descending the stairs grew fainter until it disappeared completely, leaving only one person inside the supply room. Tessa set the notebook down, pulled the bucket with the flashlight closer, and took out her telephone. The screen came to life, and in the upper right corner, the battery percentage was low. She looked at it for exactly 1 second, then turned off everything she could, lowered the screen brightness to the dimmest level at which she could still see, and began. Page 1. She pressed her palm against the edge of the paper to flatten it, raised the telephone, and took the picture. It was blurred. Her hand was trembling. She lowered the telephone, drew a breath, then raised it, and tried again. Still blurred. The third time, the image was clear. She turned to the next page. Outside in the corridor, the white light slid across the gap beneath the door again, more slowly than before, and stopped. She dropped into a crouch on the floor, hugged the notebook against her chest, switched off her telephone, and laid it face down across her thigh. Shoes struck the stone floor outside, 2 people walking several steps apart. She heard someone test the handle of the east conference room. Then the footsteps continued toward the end of the corridor, growing fainter until they vanished. She waited a little longer before standing again. Then she continued. Page after page, the handwriting changed shape beneath the light. Some letters were large and round, others slanted and broken, while some entries had been written in pencil and faded so badly that she had to angle the notebook toward the light to make them visible. She didn't read. She didn't have time to read, but certain words leaped into her eyes as she turned the pages, names and brief notes about one night or another, and she realized that what she held in her hands wasn't merely a shift log. It was something that had been written without interruption through many winters by countless people she had never met, people who entered that building after everyone else had gone home and left before anyone returned, and every night they wrote down their own proof of where they had been, because no one else in the world would ever do it for them. The battery warning turned red when she still had roughly 1/3 of the notebook left. She switched off the flashlight standing in the bucket and searched for another source of light, pulling the notebook close to the small window high on the wall where the glow of a streetlight filtered inside. She continued photographing the pages in that pale yellow light, taking 2 pictures of each page to be certain. Her hand ached from holding the telephone in the same position for so long. When she reached the final page containing writing, she also photographed the blank page immediately after it because she thought someone might need to know exactly where the record ended. Then she closed the notebook, reached behind the stack of towels, returned it to precisely the same place, and pushed the towels back into their original position. She picked up the bucket, set the flashlight upright again, and arranged the cloths to look as though no one had touched them. Just as she closed the metal cabinet, the telephone screen went completely black. She stood alone in the darkness of that room, one hand still resting against the cabinet door, and she could hear her own heart clearly. Then she went out, descended the service stairs, left through the metal door at the loading dock, and locked it behind her. Elias reached the hospital before she did, and he had already been sitting there for nearly an hour when Tessa entered the waiting room with her knit cap sitting crooked on her head and her dead telephone in her coat pocket. He stood and told her they had just said Junie was stable, that her blood pressure had risen again, and that she only needed to remain under observation until morning. Tessa sat in the chair beside him and said nothing for a very long time. At that hour, the waiting room was nearly empty. The ceiling lights shone a stark white, and a vending machine hummed in the corner. She didn't remember the journey from that night when she was 9 years old. She remembered only a waiting room that smelled of cold coffee, exactly like this one, and a woman in a yellow sweater who came and sat beside her without asking any questions, simply remaining there and holding the paper cup of warm water for her. She remembered counting the tiles on the floor. Ever since that day, whenever she entered a room that smelled like this, she began counting the tiles without realizing it. Elias's telephone still lay face down on his thigh, switched off from the moment he had walked through the hospital doors. Across the city, inside the brownstone, 6 men had been waiting for him since 2 o'clock in the morning, and by 4 o'clock, The last of them had risen and gone home, and Renata Costa had been the one to turn out the dining room lights. He knew it was happening while he sat there. He didn't turn on his telephone. Near 5 o'clock, a nurse came out and told Tessa she could go in to see her sister briefly before allowing her to sleep. Tessa went inside, then returned and sat down in the same place, both hands resting on her lap. Elias said he needed to tell her something. She told him to speak. He gave her his real name. He told her what that last name meant at the harbor, told her about the house on Federal Hill and the long table inside it, and told her that he had taken the chair at the head of that table less than 9 days earlier. He explained why he had been cleaning floors, told her about his mother, and told her about the corridor on the 19th floor. He kept it brief, adding nothing to make it sound better or feel less heavy. Then he explained why he was telling her now, instead of at some other time. From that moment forward, he would be doing certain things to help her and her sister, and she had the right to know who that help came from before deciding whether to accept it. He said that if she didn't want it, he would stop, and there would be no conditions. Tessa listened to everything. She didn't cry. She didn't appear relieved or overjoyed either, and that kept him silent longer than he had intended. She sat with her back straight, her eyes fixed on the vending machine in the corner, and in her mind there was no brownstone and no harbor. What she saw was that morning, the glass window of the coffee shop, the back of a gray uniform seated across from a middle-aged man, and the voice. She remembered it clearly. She remembered how even it had been when he spoke about the debt, and how it had remained exactly as even when he spoke about the 2 children in school. No louder, no softer, without pausing for even half a beat. She wondered what a person had to become before he could speak those 2 sentences in the same voice. "Were you going to tell me?" she asked. "If this hadn't happened tonight?" He said yes. She asked when. He said he didn't know. She nodded, and that was the answer she needed. "Thank you for staying," she said. He told her it was nothing. "No," she said. "I mean it. You walked away from something to sit here. I don't know what it was, and I won't ask, but I know there was something. Thank you." Then she rose, adjusted her knit cap, and said she needed to go home, collect a few things for her sister, and return before the nurses changed shifts. He asked whether she needed him to drive her. She said no. The earliest bus on her route would arrive in 20 minutes, and she could reach the stop on foot just in time. She said nothing about the photographs on her telephone. She said nothing about what she would do next, whether she would continue at all, or whether she would ever see him again. She simply walked toward the exit, and at the door, she paused for 1 second without looking back, then pushed open the glass door and stepped outside. Dawn hadn't broken yet. Elias remained alone in that waiting room that smelled of cold coffee, and it was a long time before he finally took out his telephone and turned it on. The signing ceremony was held in the large boardroom on the top floor, where the long wooden table was photographed whenever the company had good news to announce, and reporters had been waiting in the lobby since 9 o'clock that morning. Elias arrived at 9:20, wearing a dark suit without a tie, and walked directly from the elevator toward the boardroom door. Meredith saw him first. She stepped out to block his path, and Preston came up half a step behind her. "You aren't allowed in here," she said, her voice very low because reporters were standing fewer than 10 steps away. Preston spoke more loudly. He called for security by raising one hand and snapping his fingers twice, the way someone might summon a server. Footsteps approached from the corridor. The man who appeared was Walt Kozak. He was wearing his old uniform, neat and orderly, with the badge properly fastened over his chest, and he had returned to work that morning under a decision no one in the building had been given time to ask who had signed. He walked past Preston and Meredith without looking at either of them and continued to the boardroom door. Then he placed one hand on the handle, turned it, and opened the door. He held it with one hand, stepped slightly to the side, and said, "Please come in, sir." He spoke in the same voice he had used for years when welcoming guests, without emphasizing a single word, and for that very reason, the words carried throughout the corridor. Preston turned toward him and asked whether he knew what he was doing. Walt said yes. Inside, the room was nearly full. In the second row near the wall, a woman with her hair gathered into a neat bun sat with her back straight and a file case resting on her lap. Renata Costa had been there since 8 o'clock. The night before, when 2 o'clock arrived and Elias hadn't appeared, she hadn't called him. She had called the hospital, asked one question, and received an answer from the switchboard operator. She had remained alone in the dining room until 4 o'clock in the morning, after everyone else had gone home. When Elias entered the room, she stood. Everyone watched her because several people there knew who she was, and those who did were turning pale. She spoke exactly one sentence. "Your uncle never missed a meeting in 40 years, she said. "Now I know how you're different from him." Then she turned toward a silver-haired man seated at the end of the row and nodded. He nodded in return, followed by 2 more men, and with that, it was done, though none of the reporters standing at the back understood what had just taken place in that room. The chairperson struck the gavel and invited the legal representative to present the verification of land rights before the documents were signed. Sloane Pryor rose with a thin stack of papers in her hand and began to read. She read the parcel number, the boundaries, the date of the original registration, and each subsequent transfer. Then she read the name of the legal owner of the central waterfront parcel. The owner was a trust, and that trust bore the name of a woman, Rosalie Barone. She read it clearly and slowly, exactly as she had read every other line, and offered no further explanation. A chair scraped across the floor. Preston Vaughn was standing at the far end of the table, and he didn't sit down. Meredith did. She sat down very quickly, as though her legs could no longer support her, and lifted one hand to touch the pocket of the coat draped across the back of her chair, the pocket that still held the invitation she had slipped inside, without looking at it a second time. At that very moment, the door at the rear of the room opened. Tessa Quinn entered. She was wearing her work coat and carrying her knit cap in one hand, and she walked between the 2 rows of chairs, past the cameras, and past the place where Elias stood. She didn't look at him. She went directly to Walt Kozak beside the door and stopped next to him. He inclined his head slightly in greeting, and she nodded in return. For a moment, the 2 of them stood side by side, 2 uniforms belonging to that building, in the middle of a room filled with suits and cameras. Then Tessa stepped forward. She walked to the head of the long wooden table, opened the cloth bag hanging from her shoulder, and took out a spiral notebook with a faded blue cover and pages swollen by the dampness of many winters. She placed it neatly on the table, among the printed contracts waiting to be signed. Then she stepped back and stood with both arms resting at her sides, and she told the entire room that the notebook contained a record of every night inside that building, that it hadn't been written by one woman, nor had it been written by her alone, but by many people, and that it was time for someone to read it. Sloane requested that the notebook be entered into the official record, and the chairperson nodded, because by then, no one in the room wanted to be the person who said no. She turned to the final section, where several sheets of differently colored paper had been attached with tape yellowed by age, and she held them up for the entire room to see before she began reading. The first sheet was a photocopied page from the hardbound register Elias had held in his hands, inside the records room, without understanding what it was. At the top was a faded printed line identifying it as the Loss Prevention Register, and directly beneath it was the handwritten name of the person who had created it, written in the hand of someone from an earlier generation, Hallett Vaughn. Sloane read the name aloud, then clarified that this man had founded the corporation and that the register had been created while he was still managing the company directly, before most of the people seated in that room had even begun working there. At the far end of the table, Preston Vaughn lowered himself into a chair. Sloane continued with the second sheet, and it was the second sheet that changed the silence in the room into something else. It was a licensing agreement. The register had been digitized and sold outside the company, licensed to hundreds of businesses throughout the region so they could check the names of applicants before hiring them, and the agreement contained a clause stating that the recipient didn't need to know why a particular name appeared in the system. Sloane read that clause word for word. Then she explained that this was why someone whose name had once been entered into the register at that building would be unable to find work anywhere in the state, even at a hospital, even many years later. The handwritten list was attached as the final sheet. It contained 41 lines, written in 3 or 4 different kinds of ink, extending across generations of management. Sloane began reading from the top. The first line bore the name of a dock worker, Ray Quinn, accompanied by a brief note giving the reason. Near the middle of the list appeared the name of a woman who had cleaned the 19th floor corridors for more than 20 years. And near the bottom, only a few lines above the final entry, was the name Tessa Quinn. Someone in the room drew a sharp breath. Tessa remained where she was beside Walt, motionless, her expression unchanged. But one of her hands had closed around the edge of the table. Her father had first lost his job, then his license, and then every employer in the state had refused to hire him. He had been forced to work night shifts in another state, and on his way home during that winter night, she had become an orphan. Years later, The same machine had entered her name for the first time at a hospital, and for the second time less than 2 weeks earlier. Walt Kozak stepped forward. He walked to the head of the table and removed an envelope from the breast pocket of his uniform. It was old, the paper discolored with age, one corner curled from being pressed inside a drawer for many years. The name of the building was printed on the envelope, along with a space for the recipient's name, and in that space, written in ballpoint pen in the handwriting of the payroll clerk from that time, was the name Rosalie Barone. The envelope had never been opened. He placed it on the table beside the notebook. This was her final paycheck, he said. That day, she wasn't allowed to return to her locker and collect her belongings, so no one gave this to her either. I've kept it ever since. He said he had been the person who walked beside her all the way to the front door that day. He said he had received an order and had carried it out exactly as instructed, and that he had repeated that fact to himself every day since then. I was only following orders, he said. I've told myself that every day. Not once has it sounded like enough. Then he stepped back and stood straight, both arms resting at his sides, like a soldier who had waited a very long time to finish speaking a single sentence. Sloane waited for the room to settle before continuing with the rest. She spoke about the land. She said that many years earlier, members of Rosalie's family had repeatedly offered to support her, and she had refused them every time, choosing instead to work in that building for more than 20 years and live on the wages she earned with her own hands. She had accepted only one thing, that parcel of land, and she had accepted it on the condition that no one would touch it. She had never sold it, never mortgaged it, and never taken a single dollar from it. It had remained untouched throughout all those years until that morning. In the center of the room, Meredith Rowe rose to her feet. She didn't wait for anyone to ask. She said she wanted to say something before the legal proceedings continued, and she spoke in a voice so calm that people turned to look at her. She said she had known who her husband was from the very first day. She hadn't discovered it recently. She had known before they married. She said everyone in the city knew what that last name meant, and she had married him with full knowledge of it. Then she said that throughout the 7 years that followed, there hadn't been a single morning when she woke without wondering whether that would be the day someone finally connected their two names. She said she had climbed every step in that building, with that fear following behind her, and the higher she climbed, the heavier it became, so she had needed to push him down, as low as possible. She had needed the entire city to see a man holding a mop, so that no one in the world would ever think to place him and her in the same sentence. Elias didn't destroy the deal. He rose at the head of the table and said he would sign, and everyone in the room looked up at him, including those who had wanted to call security only moments earlier. He said there were 400 people at Pier 4, and if the project died that morning, then by winter, 400 kitchens would grow cold, and not one of those people was responsible for what was happening inside that room. In the second row, Renata Costa sat perfectly still. Then Elias stated his conditions. The first condition was that the Ashby Vaughan Corporation must immediately stop licensing the register to outside businesses, recall every copy, and send a written notice of retraction to every company that had purchased it. The second condition was that the company must issue a public apology in writing, publish it in the same place where it normally announced its good news, and include all 41 names in that apology. The third condition was that the records of all 41 people must be restored, every notation completely removed, and every organization that had used the data to reject them must be notified in writing that the information was false. He said all 3 conditions had to be completed within 6 months and independently verified, and if even one condition wasn't fulfilled, ownership of the central parcel would revert to the trust and the project would stop. No one attempted to negotiate a single word. As for the missing escrow money, Sloane had transferred the complete tracing records to the proper authorities that same morning, and Preston Vaughan left the building with his private attorney before lunch. From that moment forward, his case belonged to the law and was no longer the concern of anyone in that room. Meredith waited for Elias in the corridor after nearly everyone else had left. She didn't cry or beg. She merely said she had been wrong, that she knew she had been wrong, and that if he gave her one chance now, she would begin again, do things differently, and do them right. Elias listened until she had finished. Then he said, "You don't need a man. You need to learn how to look at the face of the person cleaning behind you. The day you can do that, you won't need anyone." He didn't say it harshly, and that was why the words remained with her for a very long time. Then he signed the divorce papers that same afternoon, exactly as he had promised himself he would. As for Tessa, he didn't give her a single dollar, arrange a job for her, or call anyone on her behalf. Her name was removed from the system at the same time as the other 40 names, according to the terms of the settlement, not one day sooner, with no exception made specifically for her. The false notation in her hospital employment record was removed under the same written order. Junie's application was returned to the evaluation process through proper procedure because her sponsor's employment status had been re-established, and the center sent a notification letter in the same polite voice it had used to deliver the opposite news several weeks earlier. The nursing school readmitted Tessa for her final semester, and they accepted her because her academic record remained intact in the system, and the admissions officer told her it was a shame she had been forced to leave when she did. That spring, Junie was placed on the transplant waiting list, and she called her sister from the center to share the news. The first thing she said was, "Now I can finally start complaining about that machine right to its face." Elias and Tessa met again at a small noodle shop on a street near the bus station, the kind of place with 6 tables and a ceiling fan that turned slightly off balance. There was no elegant restaurant, no one waiting at the door, and Elias arrived by bus. Tessa wore her school coat, her hair hastily tied back, and she still held a notebook in one hand. They had nearly finished their bowls of noodles when she said she still hadn't forgotten that morning at the coffee shop, that she still remembered his voice, and that she didn't know whether she would ever be able to forget it. He said he wasn't going to ask her to forget. She nodded and said that was good. Then she asked what he intended to do next, and he told her there was still a great deal of work to be done at the harbor, that doing things decently took longer, and that he had time. When their bowls were empty, he set down his fork, straightened in his chair, and said, "Let me ask you again from the beginning. What is your name?" Tessa studied him for a moment. Then she gave him her name, her full name, including her last name, exactly as people did when introducing themselves to a stranger. He repeated it once to make certain he had it right, then told her it was a pleasure to meet her. This story leaves us with one very simple truth. The cruelest thing one human being can do to another isn't taking away their money, but taking away their good name, because money can be earned again, while a name stained by falsehood follows a person for life and closes every door they should have had the right to knock upon. And the most precious thing any of us can offer, though most of us are strangely reluctant to give it, is simply to look directly into another person's face and ask their name. The person who cleans the corridors where we work, the cashier at the store we visit every morning, and the person who pushes the garbage cart through the alley behind our home before dawn all have a name, a family waiting for them at home, and a dignity no smaller than anyone else's. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that together we can hear more meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And is there someone in your life whom you once passed without taking the time to ask their name? Please leave a comment below. We sincerely hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every passing day. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.